Chapter 15 Perilous Plan. As Professor Bagley heard the little man's words, he shook his head. "I think," he said, "I'd better sit down." He sank heavily into a great brown armchair and stared at the floor. Nancy, on the other hand, decided that their visitor needed some cheering up. "Well, Mr. Popov, how would you like something to eat? It's time to relax a bit, and when we're all done talking, you should have a bath and then a bed, because I can see that you've had to do some crawling and hiding to get here. Am I right?" Mr. Popov nodded somberly. He looked down at his hands, which Nancy had noticed were badly scratched, with flakes of dirt around the nails. His shoes were muddy, too. "With your permission, dear lady," he said, "I gratefully accept the offer. Food and a bath would be wonderful. But first, let me at least wash my hands and face." He disappeared into the bathroom, while Nancy phoned room service and the young men donated slacks, a shirt, and a jacket to replace Mr. Popov's tattered clothing. Professor Bagley stared at Nancy, still perplexed. "I didn't expect this at all. Really, I didn't. We're not equipped to go into Hungary. I don't know how we would start. The refugee organization shouldn't leave us hanging this way. I mean, I know we have to do something, but..." Nancy patted his arm. "Why don't we have a long talk with Mr. Popov and try to find out as much about the operation as possible?" "Let's call the refugee organization too," Dr. Bagley said, brightening at the idea. "You never lose your optimism, do you?" "Not if I can possibly help it," the girl said. Professor Bagley dialed the contact for the refugee organization and talked for nearly 5 minutes. "There's a storm watch here," he said into the phone. "The wind could start whipping up in a few hours, you know." Nancy had overheard the tail end of the conversation and was bewildered by the strange talk about bad weather. "I heard we're due to have clear skies tomorrow," she commented when the professor hung up. "Storm watch means time is running out," he replied grimly, explaining that he frequently used weather terms as a code. "We can never be sure if someone is listening in on a conversation." He paused sadly, then added, "They say they're a small group, and everyone who works with them is completely committed to 2 other operations tomorrow. One is on the East German border, and the other on the Romanian border. There isn't a person to spare. If only we could hold off our rescue for a week. Let's see what Mr. Popov thinks." When the man emerged, face and hands now shining, he was overwhelmed by the gifts of clothes laid out for him and the dinner that room service wheeled in moments later. As he ate, Nancy and the professor carefully learned as much as they could about the children, their exact location, their individual ages, and their ability to remain silent when necessary. They must remain quiet when they pass close to the Hungarian border guards, the professor told Popov. "Of course. No question about that. And they will," the man replied. "They understand the seriousness of all this, and they dearly want to be with their families again." The conversation then shifted to the choice of time selected for the border crossing. It was to have been just before midnight when the guards would be awaiting relief, and when they were apt to be most careless, tired, and eager to get home. They would not search so thoroughly then as they would at the beginning of their watch, Mr. Popov said. "But why are we even talking about such things?" "They are no longer important, since there is no way to bring the children out now through a border checkpoint." "What about the possibility of cutting through the fence?" Ned asked. Nancy shook her head. "It's probably wired." "You mean it will electrocute on contact?" Ned commented. "I don't know about that, but I imagine it must be connected to an alarm," Nancy replied. "How about digging under the fence, then?" Eric questioned. "Friends," Mr. Popov held up his hands to interrupt the discussion. "You can cut the fence, you can dig under, but the risk is so terribly great that the guards would catch you. Remember, with 10 children, you cannot move very quickly. No, we must think of something completely different." There was silence until Ned snapped his fingers. "I've heard of people escaping by balloon," he said eagerly. But seeing the frowning faces of his listeners, he dropped the idea. "Where are we going to get a balloon, anyhow?" Nancy studied Mr. Popov for a moment. She was startled to see tears in his eyes. She hurried to his side and put her arm around his thin shoulders. "I am so afraid," Mr. Popov said, half choking, "that I will never see my wife or the children again. It is only a matter of days, perhaps hours, before they find us." Nancy felt tears spring to her own eyes as she hugged the man encouragingly. "Mr. Popov, you are one of the bravest people I've ever known, because you are afraid. But you do what you have to anyway. You have to fight twice, once against your fear and once against your enemy. You are a remarkable man, and we are proud to help you." Mr. Popov squared his shoulders and said in his still choking voice, "Thank you, Miss Drew. Thank you." "And don't worry," Nancy continued, "because we will be there to get you, all of you, tomorrow night." Professor Bagley gulped. Nancy, I'm not sure we should make such a flat promise like that one. We might find it too hard to keep." "Trust me, Dr. Bagley," the young detective said. "I have a plan. It's not complete yet, but I know it will work." She looked at him imploringly. At last, the professor gave way, and she smiled a little. "Who can resist you, Nancy? Okay, let's give your plan a chance. Particularly since I don't have one of my own." The girl inhaled deeply. "So far," she said, "only the 4 of us know about the children, right?" "Right," Eric replied. "Well, we're going to need assistance. We have to bring in Bess, George, Dave, and Bert." Nancy ran her hand through her hair and paced back and forth. "For now, Mr. Popov, you stay here in this room, and we'll ask the hotel to bring in a cot. Okay, Dr. Bagley and Eric?" They nodded. "Thank you," Mr. Popov replied. "I'm very tired, but I must be up by 2 a.m. and on my way back so that I can cross before daylight." "That's fine," Nancy said. "We'll send you along with a duck call. Ned, we must find a duck call." "A duck call?" the young man said in amazement. "What in the world are you going to do with that?" "We'll use it for a signal. Get 2 duck calls. Tomorrow night, Mr. Popov will listen for it. When he hears it, he'll answer us. Just 3 short bursts. Quack, quack, quack. That's all. It will be a new moon and black as pitch, so it's the only way we'll be able to find one another. Besides, it's a natural sound and won't arouse suspicion," Professor Bagley remarked. "Or not much, I hope," Nancy said. "The call's a good idea," Mr. Popov concurred. "The place we're staying in isn't a house. It isn't even a hovel, just a hut. And we have no lights. Even if we did, we couldn't show them." "Wait a minute, Nancy," the professor interjected. "We have to start thinking about what is physically possible. Now, you know I can't really run. My left leg has been stiff ever since they flattened me for doing that column of music criticism for the River Heights newspaper." The young people laughed at the professor's habit of making a joke about the wound he had received in combat. "So," Dr. Bagley continued, "that means I'm going to be kind of a fifth wheel in this operation." "Not really," Nancy replied. "You are the most visible one. You are the person the other side has been watching most. That could prove to be a very valuable asset." "You mean I could be your decoy?" "Yes, you and Eric could draw attention away from the real rescue attempt, while the rest of us waltz across the border with the Popovs and the children." Professor Bagley pulled his ear thoughtfully. "Well," he said, "I wouldn't include Eric as a decoy. In fact, my boy, I think it's time to say something, don't you?" Guess so. The young man smiled from his position on bed where he'd been sitting ever since his wheelchair was destroyed. You and Ned had better sit down while I tell you this. Or rather, when I show you this. Nancy furrowed her brow slightly. Have you some secret weapon that will help us save the children? Oh, just a small one. Here, watch. The handsome young man stood up and walked across the room in front of the onlookers. For a moment, everyone was speechless. And then recovering, they cried out almost in unison, "Eric, you can walk!" End of chapter 15.